Hello and welcome to this podcast from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is David Crystal, probably the best-known linguist working in the UK today, and certainly the most prolific. David's output ranges from encyclopedias and reference works to academic studies and even a memoir. His latest book is called A Little Book of Language, and is aimed particularly at young teenagers, but I think it would entertain and inform anyone with an interest in the myriad aspects of language that it covers. When we met, I began by suggesting that one way of grasping how much our attitudes to and knowledge of language have changed is to reflect on what A Little Book of Language published a century ago would have been like.
Well, yeah, certainly the last 100 years is a pretty critical period, really. This time, a century ago, there was no linguistics in the modern sense of the word, really. There was comparative philology, the study of the history of language, which was mainly the study of old literary texts and the way the written language has changed over the centuries. A lot of interest in the languages of the world, trying to group them into families and all of that. But the study of the spoken language, and a whole range of varieties of the spoken language, and thinking about language from the point of view of its presence amongst us and what it does, not just to communicate meaning, but to express our identities and all of this. This is all a 20th century thing, and linguistics as a subject grew out of that kind of initial curiosity about how the living language works. I mean, that's the contrast, dead languages before, living languages now. And very important in any introductory book on language, therefore, to avoid taking sides, to point out that both sides are important. You have to have a historical perspective and the written language and all that sort of thing, and you have to have a modern perspective with the spoken language and all that sort of thing. And so getting that balance is absolutely critical, but it's a balance that came after the 19th century was over, and indeed after much of the 20th century was over. You know, in the 21st century, we can see that both trends are co-equal.
And presumably the notion of good language and bad language, or right and wrong, were things which were much more prescriptive 100 years ago, and now there's a much more descriptive attitude to it.
That was a big change in the 20th century. Yes, the prescriptive attitudes towards language, that there was a right and a wrong, which meant that all non-standard versions of a language were pathetic, all regional dialects and so on were inferior, and all of this sort of thing. That was an attitude that only came in fairly recently, you know, the middle of the 18th century. It's only a couple of 100 years old. But it then grabbed everybody. And since that time, in schools mainly, when I went to school, for example, I was taught all these rules about right and wrong and right. And these days, I think we've got a more balanced perspective. It is important that that children learn the standard form of their language so that they can communicate efficiently in it, and so on and so forth. Nobody's knocking that. But at the same time, we've learned to respect all the other varieties of the language that are around, and regional dialects, regional accents, and all the non-standard forms of English are seen to have a role in a full communicative life as we have now. And so current trends in school are very definitely to try to get across to kids the extraordinary richness of a language, the many varieties that there are, and all the different attitudes that there are to it, keeping standard language as centre stage, because that is so important for them, but at the same time, not getting them to knock everything else. That they should value the variety of accents and dialects and so on that exist. And that's another one of the things you have to get right when you're writing a book for kids, that you have to get this balance. You don't want, on the one hand, to give the impression that standard English isn't important, or standard French, or whatever it might be. On the other hand, you want to wean them away from this traditional concept that regional accents and dialects are somehow inferior, or that people who speak them are sort of thick or something. You know?
Yeah, the book is very sensitive to context, isn't it? And making readers aware of the fact that they probably already use different kinds of language in different situations instinctively.
That's a very important point, yes. When kids go to school, they are taught at the very beginning the differences between speech and writing, because they learn to read and write, and they realize suddenly that the written language is very different from the spoken language. But nobody has to teach them that there are such things as different styles of speech, or for that matter different styles of writing, because they've heard and seen these from as early as the third year of life. They've encountered different styles, you know, parents telling their kids off for speaking with their mouth full, or for swearing, or for saying she when they shouldn't, and don't say that, it's rude, all that sort of thing. They've gradually learned that there are these different acceptabilities and different appropriatenesses. There is a time and a place for every use of language. When they get to school and learn to read and write, they learn that lesson even more so. And now the teachers start telling them about how to write essays and how they shouldn't put little stories and how they shouldn't put colloquialisms into it. And they're developing their sense of style all the time. And it is partly a matter of instinct, but it is also partly a matter of training, because there are just so many variations in language that they have to master. And this situation is getting more complicated rather than less as time goes by, because now that the internet has come along, a whole new range of varieties of language are now available to kids. And to adults too, of course. And we've all got to learn to manage these things and manage them efficiently, and learn that the abbreviations you put into your mobile phone, for example, are not going to be appropriate if you're writing a formal letter of inquiry for a job. And all of this, lots of kids assimilate without any trouble at all. But a stubborn minority of kids do have difficulty seeing the point. And so there is still a need for a curriculum that teaches children how to manage these different varieties.
I wondered if, when you were the age of the young readers that this book is written for, were you already fascinated by language? And if so, what was it about language that fascinated you then?
I certainly was. And the reason is quite clear, because I was brought up in a bilingual area in North Wales, where there was Welsh and there was English. And there was English spoken at home. My family did not speak Welsh at home, but on the street it was there. And I remember at a very early age, in my 3rd or 4th year, being puzzled about why I could understand you, but I can't understand you. What's going on here? This was a real puzzle to me. Slowly it got worked out, because kids would tell me, and kids who spoke Welsh would teach me bits of Welsh, and you learned that there were many different ways of communicating. When you went to school, of course, you learned the language as a second language in the classroom. And then gradually, as you went through school, especially secondary school, other languages came along. I learned French and Greek and Latin and so on. And then you became aware of the importance of multilingualism as a phenomenon. So I think that's the idiosyncrasy of my own background. These days, I think everybody is aware of multilingualism as a phenomenon, partly because of the media and the fact that you see these things on television so much, and on the radio, and on the internet, of course, especially these days. But also because the existence of immigration in all countries has suddenly upped the ante as far as levels of multilingualism are concerned. I mean, there are 400 languages spoken in London, let alone the numbers in other cities. And so you can't avoid the existence of multilingualism. And therefore, one of the reasons for writing a book of this kind is perhaps to give kids an informed background about why multilingualism exists, how to cope with it, how to deal with it, how to interact with it, how to make themselves a little multilingual, even if the curriculum doesn't allow you to do so, because they're not teaching languages as much as they should at secondary level. Nonetheless, you can go out and do your own language learning.